I checked online, your website. You have manufacturing plants in Australia, in China, USA, Northern Ireland, and the Netherlands. The way that these countries produce power varies quite a bit. Australia and China are still heavily reliant on coal. According to a 2022 report, the generation factor for the Australian grid is 0.68 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour. China is 0.56. This is double what is happening in the US, 0.33. Netherlands is 0.37, and Ireland 0.38. How will you get to carbon negative if you manufacture in places like China and Australia, where electrical power is so carbon intensive?
What we have done is we have made sure that when we're sourcing energy, we're sourcing from renewable sources. So actually 100% of our manufacturing operations are covered by renewable electricity. And we've gone even further and have sourced renewable natural gas in several locations. So across the board for our manufacturing, 79% of our energy use is coming from renewable sources.
If the goal is to reduce carbon, why not move production to places like Sweden, where the generation factor is 0.008, which is 1% that of China or Australia? I mean, wouldn't it make more sense to produce it in countries where the energy grid factor is incredibly low?
Well, I think there's certainly a number of trade-offs in any decisions. And that's certainly a factor as we look at where we're located. But I think we're invested in those locations based on where those products are going to. So transportation is, of course, another impact to consider as we make sure we're delivering to our global customers.
Right.
And I think that Interface likes to be a source of outsized impact. So how can we also impact the places that we're in to motivate change to lower impacts? And I think that we see that by, we're investing in renewable sources in those locations so that we can clean up those grids as much as is within our power.
That's a really interesting statement of how it is that you impact the locations where you're in. Give me an example of how that has transpired in the past.
We've invested in renewable energy sourcing at all of our locations and trying to bring the grid cleaner. But there are also some really interesting things that we've looked at over the years, including what's called factory as a forest. So we've looked into how could we create a factory that is indistinguishable from the forest that would have been there, or, whatever ecosystem would have been there had that factory not been in place. So what are the impacts of a forest? What kind of water is it infiltrating in that location? What kind of habitat is it providing for birds, bees, other species? What sort of solar gain is happening there? And how can we look at our factories to make it so that we are as good as the environment that would have been there had our factory not been built? Nigel
Stansfield, who I interviewed last season, talked about factory as a forest. Nigel is, of course, the Chief Innovation and Sustainability Officer at Interface. We had an interesting conversation about the legacy of Interface, and he explained the factory as a forest as a new model of production. Interestingly, this is happening in Australia then, isn't it? I mean, the place with the highest emissions and generation factor for the energy grid.
So we started looking at how we could do that in our Minto factory in Australia. And we've also looked at how we could apply that in our factory in the US. And it's certainly a methodology as we continue to tweak and build parts of our infrastructure in various locations, that every time we do, we're thinking about how can we be more aligned with nature.